yeah, if you maybe one more example, and then
So another example, this will be a harder example to give just because we don't have a whole lot of time. But again, the most famous and most controversial passage, I think, in the Hebrew Bible when it comes to the New Testament's use of the Old Testament would be Isaiah chapter 7. Okay. And so then in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the New American Standard says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, okay, is it a virgin? And is it will be with child? And then in the JPS, assuredly my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child. Okay, so here's what's really interesting. You've actually got kind of a hybrid where the correct Hebrew reading, I think, is kind of reflected when you merge both of these texts together. So for instance, here it says will be, the verb they translated as will be. Okay, there's no, the verb is not will be, you actually have an adjective, pregnant. It's a nominal clause. Okay, so the Alma is pregnant. It doesn't say will be pregnant. It's just an adjective. And so that's the first thing, is that I would say that the Jewish translation gets it right, is with child. Okay, but then the question is, are we dealing with a virgin or are we dealing with just a young woman? And if a woman is with a pregnant woman, or pregnant one woman, is hardly a sign. But is this virgin pregnant? Okay. And so then the question is, are we dealing with a virgin or are we dealing with a young woman? And if we're dealing with a virgin, why is the word here used different than the standard word for virgin, which is betula? Okay. And so you've got to then engage with a very careful reading of the text. And what's really interesting here is that in the book of Isaiah, okay, if you go to Isaiah chapter 54, okay, and in chapter 54, verse 4, okay, and again, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover this in a short podcast, but what's really interesting is that you have the word here, the reproach of your youth. So in Isaiah 54, it's describing a situation where Jerusalem is being used as a metaphor as a mother without children, as a woman without children. And then Isaiah goes on to describe the different shames of women who don't have children. And he uses two metaphors. The first metaphor he uses, if you look at a verse there, let's see here. Yeah, in verse 54, in verse 4 of chapter 54, you've got two different metaphors. You've got the shame of not having a children, like the shame of your youth. Like you don't have a child in your youth, but then you have another shame, which is the reproach of widowhood. So there is two different metaphors being used, two different pictures being used. Now, what's interesting is in verse 5 then, and by the way, the shame of your youth, it's the same root as the root word for virgin, or the word that's used in Isaiah 7:14. In other words, verse 4 becomes crucial in defining what an Alma is. Is it just a young woman or is it a virgin? And what's interesting is verse 5 then basically does something quite spectacular. Is the first part of the verse provides the solution to a woman who doesn't have a child because of her alumim, her whatever that state is. Notice that your husband is your maker. Okay. And then it says, if you skip down 2 lines, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Now, why is that interesting? Because for a widow, the solution to a widow not having a child is that she needs to be redeemed. Somebody needs that. Okay. So that solves the problem of not having a child because you're a widow. But the first part, your husband is your maker. The husband solves the problem of the shame of your youth. In other words, the solution to not having a child because of your state of youthness is you need to get married, which means that the word for youth used in Isaiah 7:14 is a word for a young, unmarried woman. It's a woman who's young, who immediately enters the age where she's marriable. She's sexually able to be married, but she can't have a child. And Alma can't have a child until she is taken by a husband. So an Alma cannot be pregnant until a husband takes her, and only afterwards. And so here we have a situation in Isaiah chapter 7 and in Isaiah 54, where only by wrestling with the Hebrew and knowing the root of the Hebrew word can you realize that what we actually have in 7:14 is an Alma has to be an unmarried, a very young unmarried woman. And what's interesting is everywhere that it's possible to confirm the meaning of Alma, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and it's hardly used. I think it's used 8 times Alma. In some of the cases, it's used as a title, so you don't know what the word means. But in those cases where it's clear what it means, we're dealing with a young, unmarried woman. And so only by wrestling with the Hebrew that you suddenly realize that Isaiah 7:14 has to be, based on its use in Isaiah 54, that Alma is an unmarried woman she's not had sex yet. She's not been married, not been taken, but she's pregnant. So the correct translation of this passage is, therefore the Lord himself will give you a son. Behold, a pregnant virgin will bear a son, or is bearing a son. Okay. And so the point being, here's another example. And by the way, the moment you've actually demonstrated that the best translation or the best interpretation of Alma is virgin, then you're suddenly realize that you're basically in a situation where there cannot be double fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 7. If that's the best reading of the verse, then there can't be double fulfillment. And then you've got to deal with the historical context. But the point is, by wrestling with the Hebrew, you suddenly realize that I think Matthew got it right. He didn't get it wrong. He's not using sensus here. He's not kind of double fulfillment here. I think he gets what the text actually says. So there's another.
Yeah, very powerful and very engaged example, and wonderful example, I think. Yeah. So, and it shows why I think that it is a very, very poignant way of like showing how it makes sense to engage with the languages, and why we should take our time to study the original language of the Word of God.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you enjoyed it, you can find another one by clicking just over here. Or if you want to watch the full episode and dive a step deeper, you can find a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.